This is 1930s Britain. For the first time, black and white films, now in colour. Bringing new life to the good times and the bad.
It's a turbulent decade. The best things happen and the worst things happen.
3 kings in 1 year. The monarchy in crisis. A government gambles everything in a desperate attempt to stem the Nazi tide.
Looking back in history, we say, well, how can they not be 360-degree aware of the reality of what they were facing?
This time, the mid-1930s, Brits enjoy new freedoms.
People are showing their bodies for the first time, and especially for women. It's very liberating.
The Nazi threat grows.
It's rather startling to see the Union Jack and the Nazi swastika flag side by side.
They're marching through a Kent street. Wow, I had never seen this before.
Britain strives for peace, but prepares for war. This is the 30s in colour. Countdown to war. By 1935, Adolf Hitler had established complete control over Germany. But it was still unclear what threat he posed to Britain, where a whole new world was emerging. A boom in car production and new roads meant an escape from town to country. And the Holiday Pay Act meant that ordinary working people could now enjoy a proper break.
Hello there. Well, this year we got holidays with pay. Look at it. Woo! Isn't that lovely?
There was a new and glamorous holiday destination on offer.
Butlins, fantastic fun. I didn't go until the 60s, but, you know, it's incredible fun.
This is before people took flights to the Algarve or the Costa del Sol. This provided an opportunity for people often from inner cities to go somewhere and enjoy a holiday as a family.
The idea that ordinary working-class Britons could enjoy a holiday was completely alien before the 1930s. It was a hugely exciting moment and a real moment of social mobility.
Thousands could now go on holiday to resorts and camps like Butlins in Skegness, Clacton, and later Bognor Regis. Founded by Billy Butlin on the neat idea of a week's play for a week's pay, these camps promised 3 meals a day and organised fun for all the family, from dawn till dusk.
My father came over from Canada and he stayed in a guest house. You had your breakfast and your evening meal there, but they didn't want to see you for the rest of the day. So you had to amuse yourselves. He saw that there was a great opening for an amazing business. That's how he started Butlins. I love the ethos. It was there right from the beginning to even till today. Our true intent is all for your delight. My father, right from the very beginning, wanted to provide holidays for everybody, and his ethos was to make everybody happy. It's lovely to see it in colour as well. It's amazing.
Then, as now, the fun was ruthlessly organised by Butlin's iconic redcoats. They'd rouse holidaymakers at 7:45 sharp for their daily activities. Today, it's a more optional endeavour. Redcoats Freya and Jake carry on the tradition.
Wow, look at this. Costume and figure competition.
Imagine if we had that now.
I'd win that easily.
Would you? Yeah, all right. Like the hair and just the swimsuits and stuff is so different to now. Now everyone's got those top knot bum things. Isn't it mad how times have changed? What's that? Knobbly knees competition. Now I get why we don't do it.
Yes. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy, isn't it? Well, couldn't do that nowadays, could we?
It's hilarious, you know, we just wouldn't even think to do this in our time.
I think, are they really having fun? Is this what fun looks like, 1930s style?
It's just good family fun. Fathers with daughters. Oh, there's my father. Ah, with the moustache. It's so lovely to see him there. What a handsome man he was. And my mother always said she fell in love with him. You know, when she first saw him, she thought, oh my God, he looks like Errol Flynn.
It makes you feel proud, doesn't it?
We're doing the same things. We are literally doing the same job and creating the same happiness, the same memories, the same magic.
When the holiday was over, the organised activities went on at home. In the 1930s, a health and fitness craze gripped the nation. With a link between obesity and heart disease newly confirmed in the press, the pressure was on to keep in shape. The Women's League of Health and Beauty offered group exercise classes for women of all kinds, and the cameras flocked in to enjoy the spectacle.
It's a forerunner to the fitness crazes of today, yoga and some such, but it was really quite new in the 30s.
Many of them thought they'd never stoop so low. But now, thanks to these rhythmic exercises, they can not only touch their toes, but almost bite them.
Commentary is something else. Commentary, you'd rather switch it off.
On the hands down can be ornamental as well as useful. Here's an exercise that suggests rocking chairs.
It's very reminiscent, for those people who remember it, of Harry Enfield's satires of these kind of public information films. They're just unbelievably patronising, cliched, jaw-dropping comments about young ladies and their legs.
It seems but yesterday that the female leg was looked upon as something that shouldn't be looked upon.
The League of Health and Beauty was so popular it gained almost 200,000 members by the end of the 1930s. Women of all backgrounds were encouraged to take part, donning their matching gym kits and taking to the fields.
They are surely the original Bridget Jones' big knickers, aren't they?
It's quite a change. Here you are seeing women wearing very short shorts, and 30 years earlier, people were covering up table legs and chair legs because they were so prudish in their Victorian morality.
Cycling without a cycle is a great exercise.
And it's new in the sense that sort of working out in public for the first time, and especially for women, that's very important that they can use their physicality in a way they hadn't been able to before. Yeah, it's very liberating, I think. Now, the downside of this isn't just about physical health, this is about racial health and racial fitness, and this is a hangover from social Darwinism around survival of the fittest and survival of the fittest nations. And underlying this exuberance is a kind of concern about the survival of the white race.
I'm sorry to bring a sour note into this sort of potentially light-hearted, silly 1930s film, but it's actually connected to a whole lot of eugenic ideas about race and motherhood and what women were for, which was breeding the next generation of healthy British men.
This obsession with health, race and beauty was to take the most sinister of turns in the years ahead. And Britain got dangerously close to embracing Nazi ideals.
So I think this is one of the things that's really hard to understand about the 30s. How could this have gone on?
In mid-1930s Germany, military conscription meant unemployment was falling fast, and Hitler was starting to rearm. In Britain, the worst of the unemployment crisis was behind us, and in towns and cities, we were busy building. Futuristic factories producing life-changing products started to emerge. The most iconic of all was the Hoover building. When this revolutionary American company opened its factory in West London, it was hailed as a modern palace of industry.
The building is supreme Art Deco. Art Deco represents modernity, streamline, beauty, newness.
To the people of that time, it must have seemed like a pyramid seemed to the ancient Egyptians, like a miraculous building of wonders.
In the 1930s, vacuum cleaners were transforming British homes, and Hoovers were the most popular cleaners on the market.
Busy housewives sigh regretfully for an electric vacuum cleaner.
Inside the factory, the ultra-modern technology and appropriately clean interiors were a unique selling point. This sneak peek through their doors was designed to lure in even more customers.
There are 879 parts and 3,631 operations in its manufacture.
Now, I remember my parents talking about this almost as if it was utopian, that it's the idea that in the future, factories would be like this, clean and modern, and you wouldn't have people dying of industrial disease.
This would be handy in the bathroom for rebristling old toothbrushes.
Interesting to see the man had goggles on, so a very strong sense of safety.
My granddad worked for Hoover as an engineer in the 50s, and it's fantastic to see, even in a 20 years difference, how this has changed from quite a humble beginning and something quite new and innovative to something that was in every single household.
Here, one of the extensions of the dusting tools is being bent so that it will go into odd corners and otherwise unget-at-able places with a minimum amount of stooping and craning by my lady. Nobody ever fell off a stepladder using one of these sweepers.
There's the lucky recipient using the Hoover on her, no doubt, synthetic carpet.
At last, milady can make light of her housework, hardly realising how much care, energy and patience have been spent on her behalf.
But the irony with all this is that all these appliances make housework somehow fun and exciting, apparently. And instead of that work being done by servants for money, it's now done by housewives for free, with the added excitement of an appliance, which I think is one of the biggest changes, really, for women in this time.
British industry was about to switch to a war footing as tensions mounted in Nazi Germany.
European statesmen have been staggered by dictator Adolf Hitler's latest move in denouncing the treaties of Versailles and Locarno as nothing more than scraps of paper.
The British government began to prepare for the threat of gas attacks. And factories across the nation were dedicated to preparations for a war most people wanted to avoid at all costs.
The government consider that in time of war, everyone ought to have a gas mask. Everyone, whether rich or poor, whether they have the money to buy it or not. We hope they will never be needed.
So says Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for the Home Department, when he formally opens the government-owned factory for mass-producing gas masks.
It's interesting that the war was already being prepared. There's already a dawning realisation that the threat of war is really serious. So, of course, this created a good deal of anxiety, and I think that fuelled the popular support for Chamberlain and his policy of appeasement.
Neville Chamberlain and the British government had been pursuing a policy of appeasement, trying to keep the peace with Adolf Hitler, who had broken international law by marching his troops into a stretch of land in West Germany known as the Rhineland. The government hoped that by turning a blind eye, Hitler would be satisfied, and gas masks and another war could be averted.
Neville Chamberlain was straightforward. He just wanted to make sure there wouldn't be a war. And he remembered the First World War and was determined it shouldn't happen again.
By 1937, I don't think anyone would have said that war was inevitable, but it would have been a brave man who would have ruled it out entirely. Hitler's built up the German armed forces from scratch. He has developed an incredibly powerful air force. And so, while the British government was doing everything it could to avoid a war, the very possibility of war was being widely discussed, and if there was to be a war, people thought that gas was likely to be used.
500,000 gas masks were being produced a week, and ordinary Brits of all ages dutifully waited to be fitted.
So the demonstrations of how to breathe with them are quite something. And trying to entertain this screaming child that is no doubt terrified by her mother's quite dramatic transformation when she's put the gas mask on.
Oh God, now she's got to wear one.
The general feeling was that you had to put the children first. They should be told about gas masks.
That is just horrible. Seeing a young child being terrified like that.
And I remember at school, we were all asked to try on gas masks. Gas was something people were very frightened of. It really is important to understand that one of the main reasons for this fear was, of course, the use of gas in the First World War.
It's just a tiny snapshot of the trauma that children, especially, had to go through in the 1930s and 40s, and it's not surprising that it shaped their experience for the rest of their lives.
Whilst preparations for war rumbled on, the overwhelming hope was still to maintain peace with Nazi Germany. And shocking scenes played out in rural Britain. This rare and mysterious home movie from 1936 shows a highly unusual trip in Kent, between a British boys' club, known as the Britannia Youth Movement, and Hitler's very own organisation, the Hitler Youth.
So here we've got Brits saluting the swastika, we've got the Hitler Jugend, as it's called in Germany, and then our guys in sort of cadet uniform, they're marching through a Kent street. Wow, I had never seen this before.
Not a lot is known about the Britannia Youth. It's rather startling to see the Union Jack and the Nazi swastika flag side by side, and young Germans of the Hitler Youth trying, not entirely successfully, to do the goose step. I think the grass gets in the way.
It really is a fairly chilling sight. Hearty British teenagers marching alongside German fascists.
This is one of the things that's really hard to understand about the 30s when we know what happened later. How could this have gone on?
Hitler, above all, gave a sense of mission to young people. And among a lot of people in other countries, even in France and Britain and so on, there was a sense of amazement, delight, excitement about the rise of the Nazis.
You said this was 32, 33, 34, you might say, turn a blind eye to it, but I mean, 1936, the things that were known about the Nazis by this time, you know, with thousands of people locked up, with Jews having been deprived of their livelihoods and the means to work.
By the start of 1937, the Hitler Youth was compulsory for all Aryan children aged 14 to 18 and had over 5 million members. These youths would go on to form the bedrock of the future Nazi army. The film also shows the Britannia youth visiting Germany. And one young member even captured the Führer on film.
I mean, it's extraordinary that people believed him to be a sort of leader of the great Nordic peoples, that they were going to breed and kill the Jews and kill the mentally deficient and kill the criminally insane. And then the person it's focused on is a dark-haired little bloke from Austria who speaks with a very, very strong Austrian accent. I mean, but then, of course, you know, why should racism make sense?
These sorts of exchanges were, in fact, part of an international charm offensive, carefully orchestrated by the Nazi Party in order to seem more respectable than they really were. And Britain was taken in.
There's a lot of sentiment that young people from the two countries needed to be friendly and to get together to overcome the legacy of war and conflict.
1936 was the closest that Britain and Germany ever came to any sort of friendly relations. This was the year in which Germany made a conscious effort to try and be respectable. They were hosting the Olympic Games in Berlin. This was a propaganda gift for the Nazis, and the last thing they wanted was people not turning up.
Whilst Britain continued to maintain a delicate peace with adversaries abroad, at home, the very fabric of British tradition was under threat, in the wake of a royal scandal.
It was just totally unexpected. It was massively unexpected. The royals were supposed to be a steady feature.
Despite the growing fascist menace abroad, most British people continue to enjoy their favourite traditions. Up and down the nation, communities rallied together and had fun. This remarkable footage captures a town get-together in Helston, Cornwall, when crowds came out, dressed up to the nines, to celebrate the start of spring at their annual Flora Dance.
These are remembrances of England's pre-Christian traditions, and they have survived Roman occupation, Anglo-Saxon occupation, the Reformation, and all of those sort of limiting ideological restrictions on culture.
Especially after the war, that resurgence of community spirit would have still played a really important part in these towns and in these communities.
This tradition carries on in Cornwall today. Nina Riddell has been reliving these steps every year for the last 3 decades.
Oh, I think it's wonderful. The band, they keep the timing, but sometimes they're having to do quite serious walking and playing, rolling down the hill, and they've got these great big instruments. There's something more in the dance than the sum of its parts. There's an extra something that by being together and dancing, it's a sense of community and belonging.
I find it really interesting, nearly everybody is wearing a hat. I mean, I can remember this in the 1950s. Most men and women went out with hats on, and people's faces, they're just so modern. It's wonderful to know that people's faces don't change as much as we think they do. People's physiog, this stuff, the bones and the eyes, I mean, the makeup on that woman there, that looks like it could have been done yesterday.
Sorry, it's this woman in the blue who has the lilacs in her hat. She could have been taken off the front of a style magazine in the 30s. Look at her hair, look at her hat, the colour of her suit, the cut of her suit. That is a perfect picture of a modern woman.
As well as embracing old traditions, modern men and women could now enjoy a new communal activity. The 1930s was the golden age of the Lido. These vast outdoor pools sprung up in cities and towns across the nation, offering cheap bathing for the masses. Almost 200 were constructed over the course of the decade.
Before, you'd had the public baths, which had been sort of tied up with getting clean as much as with exercise. The Lido is much more of a pleasure place.
The pleasure of Lidos was open to all. Since gaining the vote in 1928, women had pushed for more and more freedoms. Now they could enjoy these open-air pools together with the boys.
This was a huge moment. It's a really important step in social change for equality and for women, and it's something that seems so small.
The women, you can see that their backs are exposed, their legs are exposed.
What's really interesting is the difference in what is accepted as socially beautiful or attractive norms. Because today in society we often frown or raise an eyebrow when we see armpit hair, and it's quite evident here that young women are showing it without worry. They could show themselves, warts and all, in a way that we maybe in our society haven't learnt to do yet.
And of course they were fantastic places for courtship.
The appeal of Lidos was as much about the socialising as it was about the swimming. Denise Gent and Christine Thomas have spent many happy years here at the largest saltwater Lido in Britain. The Jubilee Pool in Penzance opened in the mid-1930s.
I love just swimming in the cold water. The sun on our back when we're lucky.
I come out feeling peaceful.
We used to sit up there and talk, watch the boys. A lot of love affairs started here.
I met my husband here when I was quite young. We've now been married over 50 years, so it worked. We had 2 daughters who have also swum here all their lives. And now the 3rd generation, 3 grandsons who are all lifeguards in the pool.
This newly colourised footage shows men and women embracing their newfound opportunity to cool off.
Their smiling faces and the way they just jump in, there's no faffing about, they're just straight in the water. It's just sheer joy, really.
It must be wonderful living in a city, especially on a hot summer's day. It must be bliss just entering the water.
Loving the swimsuits. Behaving just like we do now. The old footage is fabulous.
I think it's wonderful that people in the 30s could enjoy such a fabulous place.
The simple joys of life were a welcome distraction from sinister developments abroad. But the one institution that promised stability, the very backbone of British society, the monarchy, was now a cause of crisis. It all started with a grand state funeral.
The king was dead. Once more we cried, long live the king.
On the 20th of January 1936, King George V died after over a quarter of a century on the throne. His coffin travelled from Norfolk to London, where he lay in state for 4 days.
The king was a great figure from the First World War. He had been a famous king, he had been a very respected king, but he was certainly a king of the old style.
George V had been the first king to do a Christmas broadcast, so the king that most people felt the closest to.
There was this strong sense of the importance of monarchy. Monarchy was a key fact about the 1930s.
This is at a time when a portrait of the monarch would have sat in pubs and houses and factories and workplaces. They were very, very visible.
He was to be succeeded by his modern and glamorous son.
Edward is so different from his father. He's very modern, he's very contemporary, he has a different look and style.
Edward VIII was very popular with the people of Britain, partly because he went out of his way to visit depressed parts of the country, places that were pushed down by poverty or by unemployment.
But public opinion began to sour when salacious details of Edward's love life hit the news. He had chosen to marry his twice-divorced American mistress, Wallis Simpson. The scandal mounted, and Edward was forced to abdicate, giving up the British throne in a moving public broadcast on the 10th of December 1936.
You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
It was just totally unexpected. It was massively unexpected. The abdication of a king is something that just hadn't been experienced before.
The public was very split about this. Some of them felt very strongly that Edward VIII deserved to be treated well, and others felt no, that was really wouldn't do. You couldn't suddenly marry not just an American, but a divorced American.
My uncle, who was a deacon of the Calvinistic Methodist chapel in North Wales, was so disgusted that he took down the coronation mug, because all of those things, like coronation mugs and souvenirs and everything, all been prepared for his coronation, and used it as his shaving mug, so gradually the soap would wash away the image on the front of it.
In May 1937, Britain got a king they'd never expected in Edward's younger brother, the stammering George VI.
The coronation that shouldn't have happened, that no one expected to happen.
Community events, like these coronation celebrations on the streets of Middlewich in Cheshire, now took on a rather muted tone.
This definitely was a national event at a time of crisis, and perhaps all the more important people to cling to their love of the monarchy.
This is very typically British. Everybody's come out in their finest. They're lining the streets. There's all of this pageantry, but at the same time, it's quite restrained. They're standing, waiting for the procession to go by, and they almost look like they're in a queue.
So these lucky kids have been put in front of the camera and said, you just need to eat some chocolates out of a tin, so they're perfectly happy with that. They get to eat chocolates and symbolise the love of a new generation for their royal family. Probably more interested in the chocolates, though. The royal family for a very long time has known how to merchandise itself and to combine kind of consumerism with patriotic emotions.
What's fascinating is that Edward VIII didn't have a coronation. They hadn't had the opportunity to do it for their previous king, and maybe being able to celebrate it in this way would have cemented George in their minds as the rightful king.
In just 1 year, 3 very different kings had reigned over the nation. But far from shaking British resolve, these troubles had only consolidated a sense of Britishness under its new monarch. With George VI on the throne, a national crisis was averted. And Britain turned its gaze to the problems mounting on the continent.
There was looting, there was theft. Jewish women were stopped in the streets and robbed of their fur coats and jewellery. It was a really terrible situation.
In March 1938, Adolf Hitler led his armies triumphantly into Austria. Once again, despite British hopes that Nazi aggression would cease, Germany was expanding its territories.
You can see from the welcome that the Germans got when they marched in, and the ecstatic crowds greeting Hitler, this is hugely popular. So they're shouting, one people, one Reich Empire, one leader. You see Hitler there, he's standing in the front of the car to show that he's kind of on the same social level as the driver. He's not some kind of posh guy sitting in the back. There's a substantial Jewish population in Vienna, and what you don't see in this propaganda films, of course, is the appalling treatment. There was looting, there was theft. Jewish women were stopped in the streets and robbed of their fur coats and jewelry. Supporters of independent Austria had painted graffiti on the walls. Jewish people were made to clean them off with acid with their bare hands. It was a really terrible situation.
Whilst Hitler's reign of terror continued unabated, Britain turned to other means of diplomacy to tackle the problem. Just 2 months later, in May 1938, England faced their rivals Germany on the football pitch. The 115,000 fans who gathered to watch this pre-World Cup friendly at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin were met with a surprising sight.
All the courtesies are observed before the start. God Save the King is played. And the English team in white shirts give the Nazi salute during the German national anthem.
That's incredible, isn't it? That's very, very interesting and really quite shocking.
They are doing a Nazi salute.
The white shirts of England saluting the leader of Nazi Germany. It's not comfortable. Sorry, it's a long time ago, I know, but it's not comfortable.
And the English team in white shirts give the Nazi salute during the German national anthem.
It's just a matter-of-fact thing as far as the commentator was concerned, that England would follow suit. But I suspect he was told how he had to react.
Can you imagine the row nowadays if something like that happened? It's extraordinary that we were playing football with the Germans 1 year before the outbreak of the Second World War. But life went on, and there was an awful lot of hope that these sorts of interactions would promote goodwill.
These footballers were told to perform the Nazi salute by the British Foreign Office shortly before the match.
Sport is often being used as a tool of international diplomacy, and I think it did a lot to shore up Anglo-German relations at a time when there was a clear danger that there might be a war between the two countries.
Despite Hitler's most recent conquests, Britain was still striving for peace at any cost.
I'm sure that they look back on it with a certain amount of embarrassment. Stanley Matthews, I got to know really quite well. I know he was not in favour at all. So, politics and sport, it goes on, it goes on, it goes on.
I think if you were a person of colour, or you're Jewish, communist, or any of those people who are going to be the victims of Nazi atrocity, you would feel totally alone and appalled. This is part of the history of this country, and we need to remember it. It's absolutely fascinating.
And makes it 6-3.
The actions of the boys on the pitch made little difference. Hitler was now poised for his next act of political aggression. setting his sights on German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. And this time, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain took decisive action.
This plan is known as Plan Z, and it's incredibly secret. Not even Chamberlain's wife knows about it.
Chamberlain flew to Germany. Here he is in Hitler's holiday retreat in the Bavarian Alps, going up the steps to begin negotiations.
This is an incredibly dramatic moment. These days we are very used to politicians getting in and out of aeroplanes and meeting each other, but it was not at all normal then. And it is a sign of quite how serious the international situation has got.
A momentous settlement was brokered. According to the Munich Agreement, Hitler could occupy German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, but his demands would stop there once and for all.
Hitler was actually rather annoyed by this. He wanted to invade and take over the whole country.
And the Prime Minister comes home, home to an empire filled with joy and relief, home to a welcome that he will never forget.
And of course, Chamberlain came back famously at the airport, waved the piece of paper that Hitler had signed and said, "This is peace for our time."
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Well, this is one of the most famous scenes in all of history, and tragically the beginning of what became one of the most notorious false boasts in history.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
You see him here at Heston Aerodrome in huge crowds, and Chamberlain then was taken onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace. He and his wife were the first commoners, non-members of the royal family in history, ever to go onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace and to wave at the crowd.
And as you can see from the film, the public was entirely at one with him. And of course he knew something in 1937 and 8 the rest of us knew very little about, which was essentially that very little work had been done on rearming Britain, on defence, or anything of that kind.
People remember the First World War. They didn't want anything like that to happen again, and whatever could be done to avert it, they supported.
There was a war memorial in almost every single village, town, railway station. There was hardly a person in the country that hadn't had a father, husband, or brother killed during that time. The idea that you're going to have another mass slaughter against the same enemy again was unconscionable. And then suddenly, this fairly old, fusty English Prime Minister with his archaic winged collar had secured peace.
Chamberlain was enormously popular. On both sides, there was a clear realization that war was on the horizon. The problem for the British was that the public weren't ready for it. They backed Chamberlain in doing everything he could to try and avoid a war.
Against the odds, Neville Chamberlain had calmed the fears of the nation with this settlement. And for now, at least, Brits could enjoy peace. Next time, with just a year to war, Britain opens its doors to Europe's most vulnerable children, but tears families apart to protect its own. As Britain prepares for war, all the while keeping calm and carrying on. Ordinary British lives in an extraordinary time.